Here's your inheritance, Gase. A ruin. A fitting perch for your station.
Thank you, sir. I know this house better than you think.
They gave her a ruin to break her. They gave her the
6 years scrubbing my children's floors patterned, and still you understand nothing.
Every stone here was drawn by my father's own hand.
Your father? A nobody. This hall was never yours to claim.
He never paid the man who built his walls, not 1 shilling, and nobody in that house knew what she was about to prove. What would you have done, standing where she stood, with a single cold coin in your palm and the laughter of the people you had served still ringing off the plaster behind you? Would you have thrown the shilling in the frost and walked back into the drawing room to say what you thought of them? Or would you have closed your hand around it and gone quietly out into the dark, because quiet was the only thing left that they could not take? Esther Lound chose the second. Settle in and let us go back together to the frost-stiff lawns of Westmoreland in the winter of 1843, to a village called Netherset and a crumbling stone summer house at the end of a long, neglected garden. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and whether the wind is at your window too. She did not run. That was the first thing the household noticed and could not explain. A woman handed a ruin and told to be grateful ought to weep or plead, or at the least hurry away with her chin down. Esther did none of it. She turned the shilling once between her gloved fingers, the way her father had taught her to weigh a thing before she trusted it, and she slid it into the small pocket at her waist beside the worn brass drawing compass that had been his. Then she gathered her dark green shawl closer over her narrow shoulders and walked. 6 years she had lived at Rackham Hall. 6 years teaching the letters and the globe and the pianoforte to children who were grown now and gone to school. 6 years of ruling the household ledger in a hand so neat that the housekeeper had stopped checking it. 6 years of noticing the things a governess is not supposed to notice. She knew, for instance, that the great staircase in the entrance hall was hung on a hidden iron strap, because she had once seen the strap when a stair tread was lifted for repair, and she had understood at a glance why the whole flight could carry a dozen people and never so much as creak. She knew good joinery when she ran her thumb along it. She knew the difference between oak that had been seasoned 7 years and oak that had been rushed green into a frame to save a few pounds. Her father had put all of that into her before he died, the way another man might leave a daughter pearls. Thomas Lound had been an architect, not a fashionable one, not a rich one, a careful one, and careful men are not always paid. He had died 3 winters back in 2 rented rooms in Kendal, with his drawing boards stacked against the wall and 11 shillings to his name, and Esther had buried him and gone into service, because service was what an unmarried woman of 19 with a good hand and no money could get. She had never told the Alders family who her father was. There had never been a reason, and there was a small, hard irony folded into that silence, because the very skill that made her a good governess, the eye for a true line and a sound joint, was the thing her father had given her while he was drawing the plans for the house she now served in. But in 1843, standing on the lawn, it was just a habit of looking. She did not yet know what her looking was for. The arrival in Netherset had been 3 days earlier, and it had gone the way these things go. She had come up from Kendal on the carrier's cart with 1 trunk and a bandbox, and the lane into the village had been all mud and standing water, the ruts glazed with a skin of grey ice that broke under the wheels. Coal smoke lay low over the roofs. It had that wet wool smell that a Westmoreland village gets in a hard December, of damp sheep and peat fires, and the river running high and brown at the bottom of the street. She had seen the curtains move as the cart went past. A face at the window of the draper's, a face over the low wall of the smithy, gone the moment she turned her head. Nobody spoke to her. A stranger in Netherset was an event, and an event is a thing you watch, not a thing you welcome. The Alders family had let her stay 3 nights in a back bedroom off the servants' passage, out of what they called Christian charity, and what was in fact a way of keeping her close enough to enjoy. And on the third afternoon, they had gathered the guests, and Julian Aldous had made his little speech. He was 31 and looked younger, soft in the face where his father had been hard, with sandy hair oiled flat and side-parted, and pale blue eyes that were always half amused at something you had not said yet. He wore a bottle-green tailcoat over a cream-embroidered waistcoat, and he turned his gold watch over and over in his fingers while he spoke, which he did whenever he wanted a room to watch his hands instead of his eyes. He had led her out onto the lawn, where the whole party could see the summer house at the far end, a black shape half strangled in dead ivy, and he had placed the shilling in her palm and closed her fingers over it with both of his own, gently, as though he were doing something tender. "There," he had said, loud enough for the terrace. "A house for Miss Lound. A perch fitting for a woman of her station, small and picturesque and entirely her own. We could not have her think we turned her out with nothing." And then, because the first laugh had pleased him, he had added the line that Esther would carry for the rest of the winter. "Do try not to let the roof fall on you before spring. It would be such a bother to dig you out." The terrace had laughed. That was the part he had wanted. And Esther had said nothing at all. She had looked at him with her clear grey eyes, level and unhurried, the freckles standing out across her nose in the cold, and she had not given him the flinch he was waiting for. A man who has prepared a cruelty needs an answer to finish it, the way a hammer needs a nail. She gave him none. And she watched, with a small, private interest, as the amusement in his face curdled slightly into something that did not know what to do with itself, and his thumb worked the watch faster, and he laughed a second time, too quickly, at his own joke, to cover it. That was when she had turned and walked down the lawn. The frost had stiffened the grass so that it crunched under her scuffed black boots. The lawn ran a long way, down past the bare rose beds and the sundial with the broken gnomon, down to where the ground fell away toward the beck and the summer house stood against the west. The light was going. The sky behind the pavilion had bruised over, purple shading to a sick yellow-green at the horizon, where the last of the day leaked out under the cloud, and against it, the little building stood up black and ruined. It was not a house. It was a body left out in the weather. The roofline sagged along its spine where a purlin had gone. The two front windows were dark and empty as a pair of vacant eyes, one of them stuffed with a grey rag against the wind. Ivy had got into the mortar and prized the stones apart along one whole flank, patient as water, so that the wall bulged like a face beginning to slip. A chimney stood crooked at one end, choked, she would learn, with 40 years of jackdaws' nests. The door hung crooked in its frame, swollen shut with the damp. She stood in front of it as the light failed, one trunk on the grass beside her, the shilling in her pocket, the compass in her pocket, everything she owned within arm's reach. And for a long moment, she could not make herself lift the latch. Not from fear of the dark inside, from something closer to the feeling of standing at a graveside, when the earth is open, and you know you must step forward and you cannot. Not yet. Not quite. Then the wind came up off the beck and found the gap where the ivy had opened the wall, and the whole pavilion seemed to breathe out a long, cold sigh through its broken stone. And that small sound, absurdly, was what moved her. She put her shoulder to the swollen door and pushed. It gave with a shriek of wet wood, and she stepped into the dark. The smell reached her before anything else could. It always does in a shut-up place. First, the damp plaster, that flat, mineral cold of a room the fire has left for years. Then, under it, something dry and papery and faintly sweet, like an old book left in a warm room, which made no sense in a building this wet, and which she did not stop to question, because the cold was serious and the light was nearly gone, and a person who means to survive a Westmoreland night thinks about survival first. There were two rooms. A front room, larger, with the two blind windows and a small stone hearth, the floor thick with fallen plaster and leaf litter blown under the door and the droppings of 40 winters of birds. And a smaller back room, its own door shut, which she would leave until morning. She chose a corner of the front room, the driest she could find, the far corner from the window where the roof still held. And she did what her father had taught her to do with any ruin, which was to begin small and begin true. She did not try to clean the whole room. She swept one corner. She swept it down to the flags with a besom of dead broom twigs she bound with a bootlace, on her knees, her breath smoking, until one square of stone floor lay bare and honest in front of her. Then she built a fire. There was a broken chair in the corner, oak, good oak, and she broke it smaller and laid it in the hearth over a nest of the driest leaves. And she got out the tinderbox that had been her father's and struck it, her fingers stiffening, until a spark caught and a thread of flame stood up. The chimney drew badly. Smoke rolled back into the room and set her coughing. But some of it went up, enough, and the flame climbed the old oak, and a small circle of orange light pushed the dark back to the walls. She sat down on her trunk in front of it, with her green shawl round her, and she ate the heel of bread and the rind of cheese she had saved from the servants' table, and she was, for the first time in 3 days, entirely alone and entirely unwatched. And she found that she was not unhappy. It was not victory. It was much smaller than victory. It was one swept corner and one poor fire in a dead man's ruin, and it was enough to be going on with. She was nearly asleep against the trunk when she heard the scratch at the door. She thought at first it was the wind again. Then it came a second time, low down, deliberate, and a thin whine with it. She opened the door a crack, and a small wet shape shot past her ankles and straight to the fire, where it stood shivering and looked back at her with an expression of complete entitlement. A terrier, black and white, ribs showing through a coat matted with the frost, one ear up and one ear down, no collar, no owner that any part of it suggested. It had the look of a dog that had decided something. No, Esther told it. The dog lay down in front of her fire and put its chin on its paws. No, she said again, with less conviction, and gave it the cheese rind, which ended the argument. She called it Tib, after nothing in particular, because a thing that means to stay ought to have a name. It slept against her feet, and its warmth was a real thing in the cold, and neither of them was alone after that. Morning came grey through the rag-stuffed window. She went out to look at what she had, and to smell it, because a building tells you the truth through your nose before it tells you through your eyes. The front room smelled of wet char and old birds, which was neglect, plain and simple. But when she opened the door of the small back room, the smell that met her was different, and it stopped her on the threshold. Dry paper, beeswax, faint and old, dust that was only dust, not mould. In a building where every other surface wept with the damp, that back room was dry, and a dry room in a wet ruin is not an accident. She did not understand it. She filed it away, the way her father had taught her to file away a joint that was better made than it needed to be, and she went back to the work of staying alive. Out on the frost-white lawn, when she came round the pavilion, she found a small stack of split firewood against the wall that had not been there the night before, dry ash and dry birch cut to the length of her little hearth. And on the flat top of a fallen stone beside it, a loaf of bread, still faintly warm under a cloth, and a twist of paper with salt in it. No note, no name. She stood looking at it a long while. In a village that watched her from behind its curtains and expected her to fail, someone had come up the long lawn in the dark and left her fire and bread, and had not stayed to be thanked. She would learn within the week that it was Silas Barrow, the mason, a broad, square man in his middle 40s with wind-reddened cheeks and a mason's steel trowel always in his belt, who said almost nothing and expressed everything he had to say in the form of work. But that morning, she only knew that kindness in Netherset wore no face and asked for nothing, and she carried the bread inside as though it were something that might break. It was in the churchyard the next morning that the old woman spoke to her. Esther had gone to fill her can at the pump by the lich gate, Tib at her heel, and she had stopped a moment among the leaning slate headstones because the mist was on the fells, and it was beautiful in the way that cold, sad places are beautiful. And out of that mist came a small, bent shape in a black wool cloak. An old woman stooped double over a bent hazel stick, her face a net of lines under a black knitted cap, her pale, watery blue eyes turned up sideways to look at Esther as she passed. Mercy Hallgarth. She stopped. She looked at Esther a long moment, and then past her, down the lane toward the estate wall and the black shape of the pavilion beyond it. "You'll be the one they gave the summer house to," she said. Her voice was a dry rustle. "For a shilling, aye." And then, before Esther could answer, the old woman leaned in on her stick and said the thing that Esther would turn over in her mind for weeks and would only understand at the very end. "That little house keeps what it was given to keep. It's been waiting for a loun to come back for it." And then she straightened, or straightened as much as her bent back would allow, and walked on past into the mist toward the church door, her black clogs loud on the frozen path, and she did not look back, and she did not explain. Esther stood very still by the pump with the can cold in her hand. She had never told a soul in Netherset her name. She was Miss Lound to the Aldous family and their guests, but the village knew her, if it knew her at all, only as the governess turned out onto the lawn, waiting for a lound to come back. She turned it over. She could make no sense of it. And the mist closed behind the old woman, and the day went on, and Esther told herself that old women in old villages say strange things, and half believed it. But the words would not lie down. They sat at the back of her mind all through the days that followed, the long, patient days of turning one dead corner into a place a person could live. And here I want to stop for one moment and ask you something, because we are at the point in Esther's story where everything could still have gone the ordinary way. She could have taken the firewood and the bread and the shilling and simply survived, hunched in her one warm corner through the winter, and never opened the door on what was waiting. If you had been given a ruin as an insult, and a stranger had told you it was keeping something for you, would you have gone looking, or would you have kept your head down and your hands busy, and let the strange dry room keep its secret? Tell me honestly below, and if you are the sort who cannot leave a locked door alone, subscribe and stay with me, because Esther was that sort too, and it changed everything. Now, back to the pavilion. The days went in labor. She learned the village in the small ways that labor teaches you. She learned that if she went to the pump before 7, she would meet no one, and that the draper's wife, who would not speak to her, would nonetheless leave the shop door open a little wider when she passed, which, in Netherset, was practically an embrace. She learned that the children would follow her at a distance and run when she turned, and that after a week of turning and smiling instead of scowling, 2 of them stopped running. And she learned Silas Barrow properly, because on the 4th morning she was there when he came with the firewood, and instead of hiding, she said plainly, "Thank you. Will you show me how to stop that wall coming down?" He had looked at her a long moment from under his flat cap, hazel eyes taking her measure, this slight, freckled woman in a governess's grey wool, with a brass compass at her waist and lime dust already ground into her knuckles. And then he had grunted, which she came to understand was assent, and he had shown her. He showed her how to knock out the perished mortar with a chisel and rake the joint clean. He showed her how to slake the lime in a bucket, the fierce hiss of it, the heat, the way the putty had to be worked and left and worked again. He showed her how to press the fresh mortar into the raked joint with the edge of the trowel and strike it off clean. His hands were enormous and slow and exact. He never once told her she was doing well, but on the day she pointed a whole yard of wall without his help, and it held true, he looked at it and looked at her and gave a single short nod, and she felt it more than she had felt any praise in 6 years at the hall. And all that while, the back room waited. She had been using it to store things because it was dry, and every time she went in, the dryness troubled her afresh. A small, persistent wrongness, like a sum that would not add. And on the 9th or 10th day, moving a fallen shelf, she saw the thing that her training would not let her leave alone. Along the inner wall of the back room ran a run of oak paneling, floor to shoulder height, the old, dark, fielded panels of a good room from 60 years before. Most of it was filthy, greyed with dust, cobwebbed into the corners, exactly as everything in the pavilion was filthy. But one stretch of it, 3 panels wide, near the corner, was clean. Not polished, not new, clean as though the dust had never settled there, or as though it had been settled and then, at some point, disturbed. And the pins that held those 3 panels, the small iron pins in the beading, were paler and brighter than the black, corroded pins that held the rest. Newer. Someone had had those 3 panels off and put them back, and not 60 years ago either. Esther crouched in front of them with a candle, and now her father was in her hands, in her eyes, whether she wished it or not. Because pinned behind the glass of a little frame that hung over the clean panels, so browned with age she had walked past it a dozen times, was a drawing. A pen-and-wash elevation of a garden pavilion. This pavilion. And in the bottom right corner, in a small, precise, italic hand that she would have known in her sleep, because she had learned to write by copying it, was a set of compass-struck guide marks and 3 initials. T.R.L. Thomas Robert Lound. She sat back on her heels so suddenly that the candle guttered. Her father had drawn this building. Her father had drawn the very ruin they had thrown her, for a shilling, as a joke. It's been waiting for a Lound to come back for it. The old woman's words came up in her like cold water. She put her hand flat against the 3 clean panels, and the oak was smooth and true under her palm, and she rapped it once with her knuckle. It answered, hollow. Behind the paneling, where there should have been solid stone wall, there was a space. And in the sudden dark quiet of that dry room, with Tib watching her from the doorway and the candle throwing her shadow huge and trembling up the wall, Esther Lound understood that the strange dryness she had been filing away for days had never been an accident at all. Something had been sealed in that wall to keep it dry. Someone had gone to trouble, real trouble, careful trouble, to make certain that whatever was behind those 3 clean panels would last. She did not open it that night. She sat in front of it a long time, her hand on the wood, and then she banked her fire and lay down and did not sleep. And in the morning she did what her father would have done, which was to gather the right tools and go slowly. She had a fire poker, iron, and the chisel Silas had lent her, and a wooden mallet she had made from the leg of the broken chair. She would not lever the panels and crack them. They were her father's, or as good as, and she found she could not bear to break them. So she worked the pale pins out one at a time, tapping the chisel behind the beading, easing each pin loose and dropping it into her apron pocket. And it took her the whole short day and most of the next, on her knees, until her fingers were raw and one nail had torn to the quick and bled onto the wood, and she wiped it away and kept on. And then the last pin came, and the middle panel shifted under her hands, and she drew it out, and the air came out of the wall to meet her. It was dry air, dry and cool and faintly sweet with beeswax and old paper, the very smell that had puzzled her on the first morning, pouring now out of the black gap in a slow exhalation. Not the foul breath of a sealed grave, not rot, not mold, not damp. A dead thing smells of decay. This smelled of a room that had been loved and shut up and kept. She knelt there and breathed it, and knew, before she had seen a single thing inside, that whoever had closed this wall had not been hiding something shameful. They had been protecting something they could not save any other way. She reached in with the candle. There was a cavity the size of a small cupboard, dry-lined with lead sheet, she saw. That was the trick of it. a soldered lead box built into the wall to keep the water out, the work of a careful man. And inside it, standing on their edges wrapped in oiled linen, was a stack of large, flat portfolios, and a ledger bound in black, and a slim book with a marbled cover, and, laid flat on top of it all, a single letter, folded and sealed with a wafer of red wax gone dark with the years, and written across the front of it in that same small, precise hand. To whoever tends this room when I cannot. Esther brought them out one at a time into the candlelight and unwrapped them on the swept floor with hands that would not stay quite steady. The portfolios she opened first, and her breath went out of her. They were the drawings for Rackham Hall, the complete set, the plans, the elevations, the sections, the details of every stair and cornice and chimney, drawn full and clean, and signed in the corner of every single sheet, T. R. Lound, architect. Here was the hidden iron strap of the great staircase she had glimpsed once, drawn out plain, the whole clever secret of it laid bare on the page. Here was the garden pavilion itself, this room, drawn as it had been meant to be, a small, perfect thing. Her father's whole mind was in that lead box, the work of the last good years of his life, and she had never once seen it, because he had drawn it here, in Westmoreland, for Sir Edmund Aldous, and he had left it here. The ledger told her why. It was her father's accounts for the Rackham Commission, entered in his careful columns, every fee, every payment, every date. And on the last page, ruled twice underneath, was a single line that had never been struck through. Balance due on completion from the estate of Sir Edmund Aldous, 800 guineas, never paid, not a shilling of it. He had built them their house, every stone of it drawn true, and they had never paid him, and he had gone back to Kendal and died poor with the proof of the debt, sealed in the wall of the one small building on the estate that was too worthless for anyone to want. The journal filled the rest. It was written in the last winter of his life, and in it he was not angry, which was somehow worse than anger. He wrote that Sir Edmund would not pay, and that a poor architect could not go to law against a rich man and win, that the law was another thing the Aldous family owned. He wrote that he had sealed the drawings and the ledger in the pavilion wall himself, in the lead, against the damp, because a man's true work should not rot in a rich man's garden, merely because the man refused to honour it. And then, near the end, in a passage Esther read 3 times by the failing candle, he wrote, I do not seal these against the family. I seal them for whoever comes after and has the eye to see what this house is and the heart to care for it. A drawing kept is a promise kept. Some roots grow best in the dark. Let this one wait in the dry until a keeper comes. And the letter, when at last she broke the dark wax and opened it, was not to a lawyer or a magistrate or the world. To whoever tends this room when I cannot, it began. If you have opened this wall, then you have already done the one thing the Aldous family would never do. You have cared for this small place enough to notice it. That is all I ever asked of anyone. The house is theirs, the work is mine. But the keeping of it, that belongs to you now. Be gentle with the lime. Watch the west wall for the ivy, and know that whoever you are worth more to this place than the men who owned it. He had not signed it to her. He could not have known it would be her. But it was her, kneeling on the swept flags with her torn fingers and her father's compass at her waist, and the fire low, and the dog watching, and the whole shape of the insult turned inside out in her hands. They had not thrown her a ruin. They had thrown her the one door in all of Westmoreland, behind which her own father was waiting for her, and they had not known it, and they had laughed while they did it. She was still sitting among the unwrapped drawings, the letter in her lap, when the storm came. It came the way the bad ones come off the fells, without much warning, the wind swinging round into the west and rising through the evening from a mutter to a roar. By full dark it was screaming across the lawn and driving the rain flat against the pavilion. And Esther, who had spent 3 weeks making one corner sound, listened to her work begin to come apart. The rag blew out of the front window, and the rain came in sideways. Up on the roof, the loose purlin she had propped, and had not yet had the timber to mend, gave way at last, and a whole slope of old slates went with a crash into the dark, and the rain poured straight down through the hole into the front room, over the swept flags, hissing into her fire and putting it out. Weeks of labour undone in the space of a few minutes. She dragged the portfolios and the ledger and the letter back into the dry, lead-lined cavity where they had waited safe for 3 winters already, and she got a board across the worst of it, and she stood in the wrecked room in the black and the wet, with the wind trying to lift the whole roof off over her head, and there was nothing to do but hold on and wait for morning. And then, over the roar of it, someone hammered on the door. She thought at first it was a shutter or a branch. It came again, a fist, and a voice with it, torn ragged by the wind. She hauled the swollen door open against the gale, and 2 people all but fell inside. A man and a woman, soaked to the bone and grey with cold, the man holding his arm strangely, and the woman shaking so hard she could not speak. They had been on the fell road. They got out between chattering teeth, the cart gone into the ditch and the horse lamed. No light anywhere but the one thread of it Esther had shown at the pavilion window before her fire went out. They had followed that. Esther did not hesitate. I want you to notice that she did not hesitate, because everything she was is in that one moment. She had almost nothing. One dry corner in the back room, a little dry firewood left, 2 blankets, the last of Silas's bread. She had a wall full of her father's life's work newly opened, and a roof coming down over her head, and every reason in the world to think first of herself. And she gave them the back room, the dry one, the only truly dry place left. She gave them both her blankets. She built up the last of her dry wood into a fire in the small back hearth, and she put the last of the bread in the woman's hands and closed her fingers over it, gently, with both her own, the way a cruel man had once closed her fingers over a shilling, except that this was the opposite of that. This was the thing that Shilling had been pretending to be. And she sat up all the long, screaming night in the wet dark of the front room, cold to the marrow, so that 2 strangers she would never see again could be warm. Morning came thin and washed and utterly still, the way it does after a fell storm has blown itself out. The couple went at first light, with more thanks than she knew what to do with, the man's arm bound in a strip of her own petticoat, off down the drying lane to find their horse. And Esther stood alone in the wreck of her front room. Roof open to the pale sky, the flags awash, her fire dead. 3 weeks of work in ruins around her feet. And in her arms, brought out again into the light, dry and whole and safe, were her father's drawings. She should have wept, perhaps. She had lost nearly everything she had built. Instead, she found she was steadier than she had been in 3 years, because she understood now, standing in the ruin with the drawings in her arms, that the roof and the lime and the pointing had never been the thing. Those could fall down and be built again. The thing was in her arms, and the storm had not touched it, and neither had the Aldous family in all their years of laughing, because they had never once thought to look. Word of the storm night went round Netherset the way word does, faster than a horse. The couple had told the tale at the inn on the fell road before noon. The woman turned out onto a wet lawn, who had given 2 strangers her fire and her bread and her blankets, and sat up all night in the cold herself. And a village that had watched Esther Lound for 3 weeks and waited for her to fail, found that it had, somewhere in that night, quietly stopped waiting. The draper's wife spoke to her at the pump the next morning, plainly, about the weather, which was everything. 2 men came up the lawn unasked, with Silas Barrow, to help him get a tarpaulin over the open roof, and would take no money, and one of them touched his cap to her when they left. But the thing that changed the shape of everything was the Surveyor. Esther had written, in her careful governess's hand, to a firm of surveyors in Kendal that her father had once worked beside, and had asked them, plainly and without drama, to send someone to look at a set of architectural drawings and a ledger she had found, and to tell her honestly what they were. And a fortnight after the storm, a dry, spectacled man named Mr. Ansdell came out on the carrier's cart and spent a whole day on his knees in the back room of the pavilion with the portfolios spread around him, saying almost nothing, turning the great sheets one by one, and at the end of it he sat back and took off his spectacles and told her, in the flat, plain voice of a man who deals in facts, exactly what she had. These were, he said, the original signed drawings for Rackham Hall, complete in the hand of the architect who designed it, one Thomas Lound. There was no question of it, none. The ledger established the contract and the fee, 800 guineas, and recorded that fee as due and unpaid on completion. Taken together, he said, they were the plainest proof he had seen in 30 years of practice that the man who had built Rackham Hall had never been paid for it, and that the family who lived in it had lived, for 3 winters, in a house whose maker they had let die poor a few miles off. He looked at Esther a long moment over his spectacles when he understood whose daughter she was, and he said quietly that he was sorry, and that she should keep the drawings very safe, because a set like that was a thing that ought to outlast everyone now living. Julian Aldous came to the pavilion 4 days later. He came on foot, alone, down the long lawn he had once handed her a shilling upon, and Esther watched him come from the doorway, the mud pulling at his polished boots, his gold watch nowhere in his fidgeting hands for once. Somebody had told him. In a village that size, of course somebody had told him. He stopped a little way off, and he did not smile, and for a moment the old amusement tried to come up into his soft face and could not find its footing. "They say," he began, and stopped. "They say you have found some drawings." Esther did not answer with words. She stood aside from the door and let him look past her into the back room, where the portfolios lay open on the trestle Silas had built her, sheet after signed sheet, T.R. Lound, architect, in the corner of everyone. And she watched Julian Aldous's pale blue eyes go over them and understand. She saw him find his own house on the page. She saw him find, because she had left the ledger open too, the last ruled line and the 800 guineas that had never been struck through. She saw him understand whose daughter had stood on his frost lawn and taken his shilling in silence, and why the silence had unsettled him so, though he had not known why at the time. There was nothing for him to say. He was too clever at least to try. To bluster would be to be laughed at by the village, and to threaten would be to have it all read aloud in a courtroom in Kendal. He stood there in the mud a long moment, 31, and suddenly looking every year of it, and then he did the only thing left that a man in his position could do with any dignity at all. He turned, and he walked back up the lawn, and he did not say a single word. He was not shouted at, he was not struck, he was not ruined, and no magistrate ever troubled him. He was only, once and for all, and in front of no one, shown a truth he could not argue with, and left to carry it back up his own long lawn to his own borrowed house. That was a year ago now. If you walk out past the estate wall in Netherset today, in the winter of 1844, down the long lawn to where the ground falls toward the beck, you will find the little pavilion standing whole. Not grand. It was never meant to be grand, and Esther never tried to make it so. The west wall is pointed clean and true, every joint of it struck off level, because she did it herself, with Silas Barrow at her shoulder, and she knows the lime in that wall the way she knows her own hands. The roof is sound, honest new slate over honest new timber, the sagging spines straightened at last. The 2 front windows have glass in them now, and hold the low winter light. There is a fire in the hearth that draws, because the jackdaw's nest is out of the chimney and the flue is swept. And in the dry back room, out of the lead now, and into a proper plan chest that Silas built to her father's own measured drawing, lie the complete, signed plans for Rackham Hall, kept by the one person on the estate who was ever worth the keeping. The village greets her by name, Miss Lound at the pump, at the draper's, on the church path. The children do not run. Old Mercy Hallgarth nods to her from her doorway, and once, only once, said, "There now, I told you it was waiting," and would say no more. They have taken to calling Esther, half in earnest and half in the way villages have of naming things, the keeper of the pavilion. She likes the word. She has been offered money for the drawings more than once, by more than one gentleman who understands what a complete, signed set by a good architect is worth to a collector. She will not sell them. She did not fight to bring them out of the wall so that they could go back into some other rich man's cupboard. She keeps them. She lets Mr. Ansdell's young draftsman come out from Kendal to study them, and she stands over them while they do, and she is not their owner so much as their steward, the way her father asked her to be in a letter he wrote to no one and left for her. Silas asked her, one evening near the end, banking her fire before he went home, why she would not just take the money and be comfortable after all she had gone through. Esther was quiet a while, turning her father's brass compass over in her fingers, the firelight on the freckles across her nose. And then she told him the thing that is the whole of it, quietly, not as a lesson, just as the truth between two people who have pointed a wall together. "They didn't give me a ruin, Silas," she said. "They gave me the key. They just never knew what door it fit." He nodded, the way he nodded at a wall that had come out true, and he went home. So, that was the story of a young woman of 22, given a crumbling summer house for a single shilling by the people who let her father die unpaid, and of what she found sealed in its wall, and of what she chose to do with it. Thank you for staying with her all the way to the end. It means more than you know that you sat by her poor fire this long. Before you go, do one thing for me. Somewhere in your own life there is a small, worthless-looking place that everyone has walked past, a thing the world has decided is not worth tending. Tell me in the comments what yours is. And if this story warmed you the way that first small fire warmed Esther, leave a like and subscribe, and I will have another one waiting for you next time, in another village, behind another sealed and waiting wall. As of this winter, the pavilion still stands, the drawings are still kept, and Esther Lound is still there, watching the west wall for the ivy, exactly as her father asked. This story isn't over, not even close.